Welcome, and thank you for joining us today for Dr. Sofia Moskalenko's talk on From Vulnerability to Violence. My name is Audrey Lichter, the Executive Director of Chai Mitzvah, the Resource Center for Jewish Engagement. Chai Mitzvah, the sponsor of Scholar Circle, is a Jewish engagement program that partners with over 700 organizations and has worked with over 9,000 individuals in small group learning, social action, and spiritual and ritual development. We have over 20 curricula tailored for small group conversation for teens and adult, lay or professionally led. The Scholar Circle program was inspired by Scott Shea, our founder and board president, who authored a best-selling book called Conspiracy U, A Case Study, which unpacks anti-Zionism conspiracy theories from the left and the right political spectrum. You can find Conspiracy U on Amazon, or you can purchase it from chaimitzvah.org for only $18, which accompanies with a curriculum that we wrote for college students and anyone interested in small group conversation around Conspiracy U. We've taught this curriculum to hundreds of college students and others. The curriculum was also recorded in a series by Dr. Andrew Pessin, one of our esteemed scholars. You can find that on our website as well at chaimitzvah.org. The Scholar Circle hosts lectures by prominent scholars every 2 weeks on topics related to Israel and the Jewish community, geared towards rabbis, educators, and lay leaders who are charged with explaining the complex issues the Jewish community is facing. To that end, each lecture will have a resource guide that will be sent to you after the lecture. A recording of each lecture will be accessible on our website and shared with you through email at chaimitzvah.org. Our featured scholar, Dr. Sofia Moskalenko, who is a social and clinical psychologist studying radicalization, political violence, self-sacrifice, and disinformation. She is a senior research scientist at Design Services Group, DSG, a research fellow at the Georgia State University, and a subject matter expert at NATO, the European Commission, and the United Nations Office of Counterterrorism's Behavior Insights Hub. Dr. Moskalenko has published over 70 peer-reviewed academic papers and several books, including the award-winning Friction, How Conflict Radicalizes Them and Us, and Pastels and Pedophiles Inside the Mind of QAnon. Before I welcome our scholar, a couple of housekeeping items. To submit questions, please use the Q&A button on your screen. Q&A will be held at about 40 minutes into the lecture, but you can submit questions anytime throughout. The lecture recording will be sent to your email in a few days and will also be available on our website at chaimitzvah.org. Now to Dr. Sofia Moskalenko.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for having me. I am here in my academic capacity, but I'm very happy to join this circle of scholars and curious individuals. And I hope that, today will be the first lecture that I will be delivering. There's going to be another one later on. And I hope that I will provide some insights and get some interesting questions from you as well. So without further ado, I am going to share my slides, if I can do that. And okay. So I am going to talk to you today about what we know in psychology about radicalization and terrorism. And to begin, there are some definitions that we need to discuss so we know what I mean when I say radicalization or terrorism. So radicalization is a psychological process by which individuals or small groups, or sometimes large collectives like nations or ethnic groups, can become increasingly accepting of intergroup conflict, including violence. So terrorism is an endpoint and radicalization is a road that can get you there. And so not every political action in support of your group or your idea is a radical action. So participating in legal protests, circulating petitions, carrying political slogans, or speaking one's political mind is what we call activism. But By contrast, staging illegal sit-ins, clashing with police or security forces, burning or breaking property are all examples of radical behavior because they include an element of either breaking the laws or acting violently. And it's important to realize that sometimes the transition between activism and terrorism is a matter of being at the wrong place at the wrong time. So, for example, a peaceful protest might clash with police, and in the heat of the moment, a person may see their family, their friends being roughed up, and in that moment, they may be compelled to engage in violence against police and security forces, turning from activist to a radical. But more often than not, most often, activists never turn to radicalism. So those two categories stay, for the most part, largely intact. Now, what is terrorism? This is a hotly contested question, and there's no one definition that's agreed upon by even separate government entities within the United States, let alone international entities. But usually these different definitions include something like either violence or a threat of violence, whose purpose is to coerce, usually a government or a large group of people, like a nation, to do something in the interest of the person or a group that carries out the violence. And another common characteristic is that there is an emphasis on the terrorist's intent to scare, to instill fear, or to intimidate, in other words, to terrorize. This may or may not be relevant to what their actual intent is. And in fact, the definition of terrorism may have less to do with the nature of terrorism as a phenomenon than it does with the goals of the people who write these legal definitions in order to provide more leeway for law enforcement to identify and persecute people who are suspected of terrorism. And to make it even more convoluted with the definition of terrorism, we now have extremism, violent extremism, which allows the US government to prosecute people on US soil for things that look very much like terrorism, except that it's our own citizens as opposed to foreign citizens that are doing it. And we have hate crimes, which don't have the intent to instill fear, but they attack based on a belief about a group of people. And we have hate speech. And for me as a psychologist, all of those things, terrorism, violent extremism, hate crime, and hate speech, are all instances of radicalization and radical action. So I'm not going to be going into these distinctions past this point, but so that you know, when I talk about radicalization, it includes all of these different instances. And finally, again, to differentiate what I already did, activists are people who are engaged in political action that does not include an element of violence or illegal action. So in the United States, we have freedom of speech. And if individuals are holding beliefs that are supportive of violence, they're still not considered as doing something counter-normative even, and definitely not something illegal. And we cannot prosecute them for that. So there is a difference between radical beliefs and radical action that is enshrined in our Constitution and in our laws. And it's important to keep in mind when we go further and I talk about radical actions and radical beliefs. So radicals are people who participate in illegal and violent actions. Okay, and some important questions to start off. Does radicalization always lead to terrorism? The answer is no. So sometimes an individual may resort to crime or violence in seeking advancing their own interests, and they may join a criminal organization, a street gang, or a drug cartel, where they use illegal and violent actions to their own interests, but it's not related to any kind of political violence. And that's also a process of radicalization that shares a lot of similarities with what a terrorist or a violent extremist goes through to arrive at that final stage of their radicalization. And And so, as I already mentioned, also many people will become very radicalized in their ideas, supporting violence against a group of people, hating people, advocating for their extermination, but they never proceed to any kind of radical action against them. And so they never proceed to the stage of radicalization that is violent extremism or terrorism. Is radicalization always bad? And here also the answer is not always. So, for example, radicalization is a rite of passage for anybody who joins the military or security forces, in that they need to go through training and psychological desensitization to violence in order to do their job, which is protecting their country or protecting peace, both of which are really good things and we want them. But again, the process of radicalization that, for example, military recruits go through when they go through basic training shares a lot of similarities and a lot of psychological nuance that happens to people who progress to terrorism or violent extremism. And more broadly, every revolution in human history, from the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Colored Revolution in the post-Soviet Union, and the American Revolution, was carried out by people who acted in radical ways. And in fact, to this day, the US government would classify the Founding Fathers as an extremist movement. So radicalization is not always bad. Sometimes it's the only path of action when democratic ways of protesting against oppressive regimes don't work. Sometimes it's the only path of action when a nation requires a military intervention to protect its safety and interests. And the last question is, do people at the extreme of radicalization, like Osama bin Laden or Ayman al-Zawahiri, share the same path to arrive at that final stage of radicalization, which is terrorism? And here again, the answer is no, because as with almost all human experiences, every person is different. And the same experience will have very different effects depending on the person's background, on their biological and DNA compositions, on the environment and the norms, social norms of the environment in which they exist. So if somebody is robbed at gunpoint in a dark alley, depending on what kind of person they are and what kinds of experiences they had, they may become really fearful and agoraphobic, not wanting to leave their apartment because they feel unsafe, or they may become really kind of trigger happy and stock up on ammunition and guns and carry them everywhere and look for a fight. Or they may become obsessed with finding and revenging the criminal that assaulted them. Or they just may move on with their life, right? So very different responses. And with terrorists as well, we find very different pathways that lead to their terrorist action. So in the United States, not surprisingly, the study of terrorism really took off and just multiplied in studies and experts after 9/11. And a generation of scholars influenced by this political event came to the field of terrorism and developed the first crop of theories of terrorism, which are presented here. You see they all came out at about the same time. And they all share, you can even tell from their names, they share something. What you can't see from their names is what they got right. So all these early theories of terrorism identified that a common thread among people who progress to terrorism is some sort of a grievance, a belief that somebody, they, wronged us. And also all these theories postulate that there is a strong emotional reaction to this perceived grievance. So we feel angry about it, we feel outraged, we feel maybe fearful about it. So a grievance and an emotion are something that early theorists agreed upon that was common to progression to terrorism. However, as you can see, all of these suggest that progression is kind of a gradual and sequential process. So whether we're talking about a stairwell or a conveyor belt or a stage, you kind of have to go through these steps to get to the apex. So you have to go through stages, from seed to plant to fruit. Or a conveyor belt, you get put on a conveyor belt and you arrive at the final destination. And that is something that these theories we now know from 20 years of research and data that they got very wrong. And it's something that a lot of lay people get very wrong. And so I hope to help you get disabused of this intuitive idea, because we watch movies and we read books and we kind of form our ideas about the world and people where people are kind of reasonable and rational, and we can kind of predict their actions because sometimes they develop a thought or belief, and then they start to have certain feelings about it, and then little by little they start acting in the direction that supports their beliefs and advances their emotional impulses. And this idea of humans as kind of rational and predictable is just wrong. 50, 60 years of social psychology research demonstrates that people are extremely irrational, and they are, what's worse, unaware of just how irrational they are. And so often they end up doing things because they're influenced by others around them, and they don't realize that influence, because they're influenced by a situation around them, because they're influenced by their biology. And we're going to talk more about each of them. But the point is, all of these are not stemming organically and gradually and predictably from some early inception, some thought, and then a process that's unfolding in an orderly fashion. So the newer generation of theories of radicalization, including my own with my co-author Clark Macaulay, moved on from the idea of stages or conveyor belts to something like pathways. And I'm going to walk you through all of these 12 pathways or mechanisms of radicalization. But for now, I just want you to look at the idea that there are 3 different levels on which these mechanisms can take place. They can happen on an individual level, meaning a person without any influence from others can just be becoming radicalized, sitting in their own home, reading literature or thinking or browsing the internet. They can become radicalized. And in fact, this individual level is usually what happens to what we call lone wolf or lone attacker terrorists, right? But also radicalization can happen at a group level, which is to say, sometimes a group of individuals who by themselves, we can reasonably assume would never have gone as far, get together, and through the processes that happen in the group, small group dynamics, they're called in social psychology, they as a group can become radicalized as a function of being members of this group. And finally, radicalization can happen on a mass level, meaning we're all small parts of a larger whole. Whatever this whole is, whether it's a nation or an ethnic group, a religious group, we're influenced by people around us, even when we're not in direct interaction or direct dialogue with them, just by kind of catching emotions from them or catching little bits of conversations, feeling their moods, right? So radicalization can happen on mass level when a whole nation becomes more radical. And I think if you reflect on the past 20 years, you can see how the United States has become more radical on a mass level, which we can track in data, for example, of an increase in the amount of hate speech online, an increase in the amount of hate crime, and an increase in the amount of violent riots, right? So all of those have been climbing since before the 2016 election. And of course, after the events of October 7th of last year, there's a particular increase, jump in the number of hate crimes against Jews. And that is radicalization that's happening on mass level. Now, these are not separate entities. Like I said, individuals exist in a social milieu and then in a larger environment. and we're all influenced by people in our lives and by communities to which we belong. So very often these levels are nested, but sometimes they can happen in isolation as well. So I'm going to go through these 12 mechanisms and give you a little bit of an idea of what each of them might look like with some examples. So on the individual level, the first mechanism of radicalization is grievance. And I already mentioned how even early theories of radicalization identified that very early on, ideas that somebody, some group have wronged our people, ideas of grievance, are very powerful radicalizing ideas. And grievance can happen on a personal level. So you can feel that somebody wronged you personally, and that can drive you to radical actions, such as what happened with Mohamed Bouazizi, a Tunisian street vendor who was repeatedly humiliated by police and city officials who were trying to extract bribes from him, even as he was struggling to put food on the table for his family, where he was the sole provider for his mother and siblings. And he finally one day had enough of this repeated grievance. So he set himself on fire in the middle of the busiest square and shouted, "How do you want me to make a living?" as he did it. And that self-immolation was such a powerful example of the kinds of experiences that other people also had in Tunisia, the kinds of grievances, that it resulted in pretty much a revolution, a toppling of the Tunisian regime, and then copycat self-immolations around the Arab world. And that one action by an aggrieved person started the Arab Spring. But grievance can also be on a group level, where you personally have not experienced anything, but you feel a bond and a connection with people whom you feel are your people, and they are suffering. And so you feel on their behalf aggrieved and humiliated and outraged. So the picture on the right is Momin Khawaja. He's a Canadian terrorist convicted of terrorism in Canada. So he was a second-generation immigrant. His parents were upper middle class. His father was a professor at a university. His mother was a stay-at-home mom. He had a happy childhood. He got a degree in computer science. He was making really good money, living at his parents' home, mostly because his mother and sisters would still take care of him and wash his clothes and cook his meals. So he had plenty of money to spare. And he liked to play computer games and being online. And he found online a lot of videos of atrocities against Muslim, in particular against Palestinians by Israelis, but also just all kinds of videos, including the videos of Chechen soldiers attacking Russians. So he kind of steeped in this, atrocities against Muslims around the world video universe online. And it so affected him emotionally that he felt he couldn't just do nothing. So he started donating some of his money, of which he had some to spare, to these causes around the world. And then after a while more of steeping in this online environment, he felt that that wasn't enough. So he wanted to travel to the Muslim world and contribute to the fight. And his very first trip, he got lucky, so to speak. He was meaning to go to Afghanistan to meet with Osama bin Laden, but already in London, at his layover, he interacted with some Muslim people who, it turned out, were a sleeper cell, and they were planning an attack on really popular places in London using a fertilizer bomb. And Khawaja, being an IT specialist, he came in very handy because he could design a remote detonator for them. So they could plant the bomb, leave, and then detonate it from afar. And luckily this plot was intercepted and he was captured and tried and put in jail. But this is just a really good example of how, even though you yourself had a happy life, never had anything tragic happen to you, never experienced any kind of atrocity personally, you can still proceed all the way to violent radicalization and terrorism through political grievance or group grievance. The second mechanism of grievance is called the slippery slope. And the picture illustrating it is from the famous Stanley Milgram experiment on obedience, which I'm sure most of you have heard about. But I also bet that what you heard about it is just the statistic that 2/3 of all people proceed to the highest level of electric shock in shocking this innocent bystander just because the experimenter tells you to do it. So it's kind of a horrible thing, and people are able to do that, and most people will do that, right? So that's the kind of lesson from the Milgram experiment. But really, the lesson that I'd like to focus on from the Milgram experiment is how powerful this psychological mechanism is that Milgram captured in his method, that it allowed this experiment to replicate around the world. And to this day, 50 years later, we can still put people in this paradigm and they will do what participants in Milgram's experiment did. And the slippery slope means that each action follows a previous action, which is really innocuous. And the increment of violence is so small that it's really a non-starter. So all participants in the Milgram study were given a 30-volt shock, just a 45-volt shock, just to sample it. And they started at 15 volts, shocking this other person. And then each shock generator switch was 15 volts higher. So they started at 15, the next one was 30, the next one was 45. So they all sampled 45, it was okay. And then it went on like that, 15 volts higher every time on the shock generator. And it went all the way up to 450. And the power of this paradigm is that it is very hard to know when to stop, when the action before it was justified in your mind, right? Like 45 is okay, so 15 is definitely okay. And then, if 45 is okay, then 60 is still kind of okay, right? So if you say, okay, I'm not going to go above this, whatever that random number is, you're basically saying that your previous action was already to a large degree wrong and immoral as well, which makes it very hard to stop at any point, which is why most people progress all the way to the end. And terrorist groups know about this bit of psychology, not because they study Milgram, but because, they're astute to how to manipulate people. So when you join a terrorist group, they're not going to tell you, hi, Johnny, thanks for joining. Tomorrow we want you to bomb a shopping mall. Okay. They start you with very small and innocuous tasks, like, can you deliver this piece of mail to somebody? Or can you pick somebody up from, this place and drive them to that place? Or can you bring this package that, might look like explosives, but you don't really know, to this other person? And each increment is so small relative to the first action, which was completely innocuous, that there's no clear stopping point. There's no red line that you can draw in your mind and be like, okay, now we're progressing past innocuous and into really bad. So the next one is thrill and status, which is a really interesting mechanism because it does not require any kind of ideology to drive you to terrorism. So the person you see on your screen is known as the Butcher of Baghdad, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. And his story is remarkable exactly for that reason. So Zarqawi was a really bad student at school. He was horrible, and then he dropped out, and he never picked up any kind of trade or study. He was a really bad Muslim. He drank a lot, which is a practice forbidden by Islam. He covered his body in tattoos, so he was known in his native Zarqa as the Green Man. And of course, tattooing is also forbidden in Islam. He was an embarrassment to his family because he kept getting in trouble with the law for all kinds of things, and his father had to keep bailing him out. The only thing he was good at was causing trouble. He just loved to kind of menace and dominate, and he wanted just that. So he finally got together with a bunch of refugee Palestinians, and they were known as troublemakers, and they eventually ended up being rounded up for a plot against the government. And Zarqawi was put into a maximum security prison. Now, we tend to think of prison as correctional facilities, but unfortunately for a lot of terrorists, they become radicalizing facilities. And for sure, for Zarqawi, this was his shining moment. He loved prison. He became so powerful inside the prison that even the prison authorities had to get his permission to enter the block where he was reigning. And he loved it so much, being this czar of prison, that when he was released, he didn't leave for another 3 days. He stayed extra 3 days. And when he was released after this glory that he found in prison, you know, where could he seek even more power, even more violence? And he decided that, you know, Afghanistan and Al-Qaeda was the right place for him. So he ventured to Afghanistan to seek out an audience with Osama bin Laden, and he made it, unlike our previous character. But Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri saw so much trouble in this person that they did not want him around. They kind of sent him out into Iraq and gave him power over Iraq. And boy, did he take advantage of that. And the kinds of brutal executions and attacks on Muslims that he carried out prompted Zawahiri to write letters to him and ask him to stop, because he's undermining Al-Qaeda's entire message of unifying Muslims around the world. But he didn't care one bit. The only thing that did stop him was the American missile that killed him in his compound. And to a large degree, the horror and the violence of ISIS was the result of his reign, and the kind of social norms and tolerance for violent, indiscriminate violence that he installed, not to mention the training of his lieutenants and generals in all kinds of atrocities. And of course, this desire for adventure, for status, for power is not unique to this individual. It is particularly high, we know from research, in young men. And that's because it is mediated by the hormone testosterone. So young men peak in testosterone between the ages of 16 and 25. And that is where we see most risk-taking, most aggression, most radical actions from young men, which is something that insurance companies know very well. And that's why they charge young men much higher premiums on car insurance, because they know that they will do crazy and stupid things to risk their lives and lives of others. And in fact, terrorist groups also know this, and they capitalize on it when they appeal to young men, like ISIS did around the world, appealing to young Muslim men and telling them that they will find adventure and status and the ability to exert power over the enemy if they just come join them. And recently, hate groups in the USA have been using very similar recruiting tactics to those that we know from ISIS to appeal to young Americans. And they have very much succeeded. So, for example, the number of unique monthly views on a racist and anti-Semitic website, the Daily Stormer, has climbed from 140,000 in 2016 to almost 2 million in last year. So it's very appealing to a particular category of people, specifically young men, to be able to engage in violence and attain power without having to go through the kinds of training and the kind of control that the military, for example, offer, which is an alternative. Or, you know, if they don't have an opportunity to achieve status through traditional training, like, you know, going to college and getting a well-paid job, they may want to resort to alternative means, like joining a hate group. Next, we have unfreezing. So the idea here is that most of the time, most of us are kind of going down some tracks that were laid for us by our family, by our upbringing, by the society around us. And we don't do bad things and we do good things, not because we think deeply about it, but rather because it's just how our life is. You know, we're kind of frozen in a pattern of life and response. But occasionally something happens that blows up the tracks. Maybe a war comes into your region and everything is changed, and maybe you lose your family, maybe you're in a new place and you don't have any societal bonds. this creates what's called the cognitive opening, when all of a sudden what used to be easy to discern between good and bad is not anymore. And this is a time when people become really vulnerable to recruitment by radical groups, which again, they know very well, which is why a lot of cults will try to recruit people at train stations. And they will specifically look at those who look kind of forlorn and lost, like they haven't maybe had a comfortable bed and a shower in a couple of days, because those are the people who will be especially open to any kind of companionship, any kind of comfort. And if a radical ideology comes along with that, so be it. So this in front of you is Major Nidal Hasan. He was a US Army medic and a Muslim by upbringing. And a lot of bad things happened to him in rapid succession. First, he lost both of his parents, whom he deeply loved. They both died one after the other. Then he was moved to a new army base in Texas, where he was feeling persecuted for his religious beliefs. His car was vandalized, anti-Muslim slurs were written on it. He complained to the army officials, nothing was done about it. And then he was a psychiatrist, and a lot of patients he was treating, military veterans, were coming from war zones in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they were recounting to him what they did to his fellow Muslims abroad, which was deeply traumatizing for him. And if that wasn't bad enough, he was told that he would be soon stationed in Afghanistan. And in his mind, that meant that he would be aiding in the effort of the American government to kill his fellow Muslims. So he tried to get out of this assignment, and he was denied on several different occasions. And then his pet bird died. I know it sounds ridiculous, but sometimes it's the last straw. So feeling, this upended, this disconnected, this kind of misunderstood and neglected, he went online and searched for support, and he found Anwar al-Awlaki, a really influential Muslim cleric. They had some interactions to which we're not privy, but one day Hassan walked into a Fort Hood base, shouted Allahu Akbar, and opened fire, killing dozens of people and injuring even more. So unfreezing is a powerful psychological mechanism to radicalization. And again, we can think to present day and how many Muslims around the world and in Europe and in the US are first or second generation immigrants who are often feeling very unfrozen and very conflicted, and how easy it is for some radical ideology or radical group to use that to radicalize them and to bring them into the fold of a violent political movement. Individual mechanism of love is kind of sounding a little counterintuitive, because how terrorism can have anything to do with love. But in fact, it very often takes just that, just loving somebody who's already in a terrorist movement and subjecting themselves to danger for you to follow in their footsteps. So you're looking at Dzhokhar Tsarnaev. He's one of the 2 Boston Marathon bombers, the younger brother of Tamerlan Tsarnaev. So his older brother had everything we can kind of understand that would lead somebody to terrorism. He had grievances, he had exposure to terrorist rhetoric, he hated America, he didn't fit in, he didn't speak English really well, he had no job and no connection. Tamerlan was a different story. He was well integrated, spoke without an accent, was well liked, had a lot of friends, was in college. And the only reason we can discern that led him to that attack was because he really admired his older brother. And knowing about this plan, he couldn't stay behind, and that's the reason he joined it. Of course, it's not an excuse, but again, it's a really powerful way to get into a terrorist group. So that brings us to group level radicalization. The first one is polarization through discussion. So we have a variety of psychological experiments that demonstrate that when you put people in a group and you give them a topic, discuss amongst yourselves, as a function of that discussion, the group emerges on average more radical than it started. Okay, it's just what happens. And the reason it happens is because we tend to admire people who are especially radical, especially outspoken. And that's how the picture on the left is Weather Underground, the 1970s terrorist group in the United States, that how that evolved from a peaceful protest movement, Students for Democratic Societies, just through a lot of discussion. And on the right, you have a supporter of QAnon, which is a modern day online community of people who believe in conspiracy theories. And you can just imagine, I'm sure you already have heard this, how the internet facilitates radicalization through discussion and exchange of radical ideas and admiration for radical individuals within these groups who advocate these ideas. Competition with the government. So there is a compelling story that I don't have time to tell about how Osama bin Laden wouldn't have been Osama bin Laden if it wasn't for the US government pursuing him as long as relentlessly as they did. They kind of made him into the figure, into the symbol that he eventually became. And today we have this unfolding with all kinds of radical group. For example, in Portland, these post George Floyd protests, and even now with post January 6th protesters, it becomes a rallying cry. It becomes a symbol that the government took the trouble to put you in jail, to persecute you, to attack you, to surveil you, and it becomes a cause célèbre. So all by itself, government participation in oppression of protests becomes radicalizing. Audrey, you want me to stop? You're muted.
You have one more category to tell us about, so.
Okay, so I'll go to mass level because we haven't seen that, and I'll go to this one, which is essentialization. So in any genocide we have data on, we see in the run-up to the mass violence where a large proportion, if not the majority of the population, suddenly start acting in violent ways against other people, whether it's Rwandan genocide or the Holocaust or whatever. We see this essentializing rhetoric where the targets are portrayed as having this immutable and evil essence, and they're presented as either a pest, a vermin, a cockroach, a spider, a tick, something that feeds on blood, or disease like a cancer, or some sort of a less than human, monstrous thing. So we see this routinely precede genocides. And we see this a lot in radicalizing rhetoric of terrorist groups that is used to radicalize their members. And the reason it is so powerful is because it's kind of a rudimentary psychological mechanism that when we see somebody as a vermin, less than human, it removes obstacles, removes barriers to engaging in violence against that person. And to this day, Jews, and this is George Soros, but Jews in general are kind of a frequent target. And the rhetoric surrounding anti-Semitic discourse doesn't seem to change. It's always these essentializing, dehumanizing stories that make it easier to talk about Jews as something that needs to be exterminated because that's what you do with the vermin, or it needs to be excised because that's what you do with cancer. So the metaphors are uniquely powerful when they feed into these rudimentary defenses, right? You don't want vermin, you don't want disease, you don't want monsters. So it's not surprising that terrorist groups and radical groups in general engage in this a lot. And we see it again after October 7th kind of really spread wide and become a lot more normative than it used to be before. So I'm going to end there and open to questions.
Well, thank you. That was just so informative and so researched, and really just creates a lot of a lot of questions about what we can do about this. There are a few questions that have come in. So an anonymous attendee asks, is there a point at which dissemination of hate speech becomes terrorism by creating fertile ground for violent activity to germinate?
To Germany?
To germinate. So
Oh, germinate.
yes, germinate.
Okay. So the slides I didn't show you.
Mhm.
I think it's a very good question because I do have it in my usual talk to address this question. It seems so intuitive that we should clamp down on radical expression because it seems so causal to radical action. And the problem with it is that all the data we have, including my own, but also people like Mark Sageman, show that it's less than 0.1% of people who endorse the most hateful speech, the most radical ideas in whatever ideological direction that you're interested in, who will ever engage in radical action. So if you look at jihadi Islamist idea, among the people who support the belief that it's okay to kill women and children in defense of Islam, this is the most radical expression of jihadi terrorism, less than 0.1% will ever engage in terrorism. Or any kind of radical action, including material support of terrorism. Same kinds of statistics I can give you for, far right beliefs or QAnon beliefs or incel beliefs. So if that's the statistic, then trying to clamp down on the 99.9999% of individuals who will never do anything is very likely to backfire, meaning we're likely to overstep our bounds. We're likely to create real grievances. These grievances are likely to create real radicalizing narratives that will then be happily used by people who want to increase the number of those who act against us. And just in the way that Momin Khawaja was radicalized to action by watching these videos of atrocities, a lot more individuals will be radicalized by government actions trying to clamp down on speech. So we would be kind of shooting ourselves in the foot in a way, increasing the number of radicals who will act by trying to decrease the number of radicals who think radical thought. And, in the military doctrine, the first number one thing they say is fewer enemies is better than more. So if we can focus more effectively on fewer people, that's a better target for our efforts and a better expenditure for our available finance and manpower and security forces than saying millions of people need to be somehow handled, whether it's surveilled or questioned or whatever. So both pragmatically and also strategically, it doesn't really make sense to try to clamp down on solely speech.
So, Jordan Frank asks the question, you're speaking about radicalization on a road to terrorism. As a parallel, when you look at students in the United States campuses, what do you think is the trigger that turns a student, even especially a Jewish student, into an anti-Zionist? And many of these students are activists, in your terms, who, despite being peaceful themselves, have clear influence on the terrorism or violent behavior.
Okay, many questions. I hope if you leave here with one message, it's that the pathways to radicalization and terrorism are many and diverse, and nobody arrives via the same route. So as far as triggers, it's really hard to tell. And we're talking about, as you said, some of these students are Jewish themselves, and it boggles the mind. And, I am doing like what I can do is I can do research. So I'm doing that. And I can probably answer that question a little later with some of the data that I collect. But I suspect that we will see more radical action on the left, which is what these students are, and more violent extremism than we've seen before as a result of these campus protests. So I agree with you that it's a serious problem. I would like to point out that there's no one trigger. There's never one pathway to radicalization. This should be one takeaway message. I hope you will carry away from this. And the last part of the question was that these students are influencing radicalization, or I'm not sure I understand whose radicalization, maybe like around the world. And I also agree with that. And I think these protests are being fueled, I think we have data on that they're being fueled in part by Iranian money, who of course are very interested in fueling anti-Jewish and anti-Western movements. So it's not a coincidence that they're influencing radicalization around the world. It's by design. But it's a chain reaction, and if you focus on students, it's one set of problems. If you focus on the effects of these protests in terms of the videos that are shared, it's a whole different kind of problem, and the tackling of it is different as well. So if you want to, trace who pays for this and how they spread this information, that's one issue. If you want to discourage students from participating and radicalizing, it's a different issue.
So there's a personal question, but before we get to that, given this talk and given the many paths to radicalization and the many ways that people could become radicalized, what is your recommendations? What are your recommendations for how to stem radicalization? And as you said, not all radicalization leads to terrorism, and not all radicalization is necessarily bad. But how do you weed out the bad, and what steps can we as a country, and from personal to group to government intervention, to stem the bad kind of radicalization that leads to terrorism and all kinds of other problems for living in a civil society?
That's a huge question. I mean, again, there's no one prong solution because there's so many different causes. I think in particular having to do with radicalization of the students, and I'm not the only one saying it, but this generation, and my children are this generation, they grew up kind of extremely sheltered and protected. And John Haidt has a book about it called The Coddling of the American Mind that makes a very compelling argument that it's not normal for children to grow up without understanding what real danger is, what real responsibility is. And so they are seeking some sort of purpose and meaning and trying to find their place in the world. And our social structures are not helping them. They're being coddled throughout, in college, if we can protect their feelings, then we might as well just stop talking altogether, right? So we need a national ideal. We've lost it as a country. We used to have this American dream, and it kind of crumbled little by little. The government is not trusted anymore. This idea of rising up from poverty to riches, I think a lot of people feel like they're falling behind relative even to their parents. We used to have Hollywood, which was this purveyor of myth and all things beautiful, and then with Me Too, that became really marred. And so the America of the past, as the shining city of the hill, is in dire straits. And this new generation of Americans, they need something to believe in, and they will flock to these problematic things if we're not able to provide them with anything meaningful and good. So one direction is to do that, and another direction is to really look deeply into the money and influence of foreign powers, who all they do all day long is think of ways to divide and fractionate our society, and they're succeeding, and the internet is helping them. And every day, I hope and pray that somebody's watching it and doing it, because people I'm not a person with the power to do that, but somebody should be.
Wow. Okay. Before I ask you the final question of what you haven't said that you'd like to say, I want to just ask you this question of a personal question. An attendee says, I am going to grad school next year and would like to concentrate in the topics you've been mentioning. Which path should I take?
So I'm not sure whether that person would want to go into like a master's degree, which is a simple answer because there are now a bunch of master's programs in security studies, um, including at American University, where I teach sometimes. So that's very easy. Security studies will give you exposure to all kinds of things like criminology, political science, sociology, psychology, all within the focus of security studies. If you want to go for a PhD, there are many possibilities, and it depends on what you're leaning toward. You know, people study terrorism and radicalization with degrees in political science, international relations, criminology, of course, psychology. And you just have to kind of read up a little bit on each of those and see which one is more you. So,
Okay, great. And just in 1 or 2 minutes, if you could just let us know anything that you haven't told us and that you'd like to leave us with is fascinating. A lot of people are thanking you for such a well delivered and insightful speech today.
thank you. Yeah, I'm not sure. There's so much I haven't said. I'm not sure which would be my favorite to pick. But yeah, I would say maybe two things. One is don't get bogged down by ideas, meaning don't argue with people who have bad ideas. It's a self-defeating proposition. You even if you win the argument, you're going to lose the war. They will become even more entrenched with whatever they believe in later on. That's just research that we know. So whether it's anti-Semitism or conspiracy theories, don't bother with ideas. Focus on what's important, and the important thing is safety and nonviolence. And keep in mind that we're living in the age of mass radicalization, so it's a problem that's prevalent and is not likely, unfortunately, to leave us. So if you can educate yourself, and you're already doing it by participating in these events, you will be better prepared than 99.9% of the population.
There's so many more questions. How can people get in touch with you if they want to continue asking questions and hearing you speak and reading your books?
So I believe my email is in the flyer. Please feel free to directly email me. I'm pretty good about answering. And as I said, I will be giving another talk, I think, in a couple of weeks.
Okay,
So I'll be thrilled to see you back.
okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. So again, all of you that are on this um, lecture will be getting a resource sheet, and the lecture will be posted on our website at chaimitzvah.org that you'll be able to access. And please tell your friends about Scholar Circle. Every single lecture is well prepared and delivered. We curate the best in their fields. And so thank you so much for this insightful lecture. And we'll look forward to seeing you again. Our next Scholar Circle features Dr. Mia Bloom. The topic will be the anti-Semitic roots of QAnon. Please join us on Monday, December 2nd at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you again.